Well, with that, I won't hold back the floodgates any longer. Everybody, welcome to our, I think we're 27th consecutive journal club now, which I'm always really proud about. I should introduce myself to Chris Vogel, the president of the Atlanta Area Evaluation Association. And we are joined, besides all you wonderful folks, with the great Donna Mertens. If I don't so much to say, past president of AEA, if the bio reads right, doing this for over 30 years. We'll leave it at that. And she's here to talk about her article that came out in the latest edition of the American Journal of Evaluation, Indigenous Made in Africa and Evaluation Frameworks, addressing, I always butcher that word, epistemic, there we go, epistemic, their violence and contributing to social transformation. So with that, I'll turn it over to Donna. Thank you for joining us.
Well, thank you very much for the invitation. And I have to tell you that I actually did the math, and I have actually been working in the field of evaluation for 49 years. And that's only counting the professional work. That's not like when I was a child and I'd say, why are things like this? What can we do to change them? Which I do think is the predisposition to being an evaluator. So thanks for your interest in this article. I'll just bring up my screen for a minute to show you, let's see, the article. There we go. For just a minute. And just to give you a real brief history of where this came from, because I know we're going to have limited time, is that I met Bagele at a conference in Holland. And I had given a presentation about transformative evaluation. And she asked a question about what about the transformation of the evaluator themselves? And this was quite some time ago, and I honestly had not given that a lot of thought. And so I said, you know, that is such a great question. I would love to have time to sit down and talk with you. So we arranged to have dinner that night, and I said, Bagele, what brings you to this conference? And she said, I wanted to meet you. And we ended up, she did a sabbatical at my university while she wrote the first edition of the Indigenous Methodologies book. I flew to Botswana and did the first editing of it because she wasn't well at that time and I wanted to see that book come out. And so we have really had a synergistic relationship of challenging each other, trying to think through how can we be supporters of an increase in just interventions that lead to just transformations. And I use that just as in justice. And as Bagele's work in developing an indigenous methodology was evolving, she was looking at, well, how do the various paradigms in the evaluation world contribute to perhaps an understanding of how we could move this scholarship forward. And that's what really brought her to do the work with me in the development. I mean, the development of the Indigenous paradigm is all her. Our conversations are with the crossover and structuring of things. And so what I'm going to share with you is one of the graphics. You may be familiar with the Roots of Evaluation that Marv Alkin put out, and it's been out in 2 editions, and it's actually coming out very soon with a 3rd edition, in which he continues to have a 3-branch evaluation tree to show our roots. And he has methods, use, and values. When I started my work on transformation, I said, there's a branch missing, it's social justice. And so at this moment in my life, I would say social, economic, environmental justice, because I see the critical importance of addressing the intersection of those kinds of justice. And Marv and I had a lot of conversations about it. And he said that all fits under values. And I said, as soon as values steps up and says, we've got to take into account oppressive systems, we have to consciously address discrimination, then I'll say, go ahead. And if you want to spread that into all the other branches, I would be delighted. But because it wasn't there visibly and consciously, I said, we have to have this other branch. Okay, so Bagele came along and she said, that's all well and good. I like that branch. But if you're looking at it from an Indigenous perspective, she is now proposing a 5th branch to the evaluation roots tree. And she calls that needs and context. And this is very much rooted in the Indigenous framing for evaluation and the assumptions that guide us in our understandings. And this is where, she and I had really great conversations, because I had always looked at reality as something, well, we have different understandings about what is real. But some of those understandings about what is real sustain an oppressive status quo, and some of those understandings lead to transformative change. And, we can look really quickly at history and say, well, what were the realities of Black people in the United States when we had segregation? That was a reality that was established by a white supremacist powerful structure that had the consequence of oppressing people of color. And so our job is to look at the various versions of reality and bring to light the ones that are going to help us move forward. Now, that's what I brought to it. When Bagele looked at it, she said, that's all well and good, but I think we need to bring in the spiritual context. Okay. And I don't know about you, but when I was brought through my academic program, it was made very clear to me that spiritual is on one side and research and evaluation is on the other side, and neither should ever mix. But if you're coming from the Indigenous culture where spirituality is huge, how can you ignore that as something that needs to be considered when you move into communities and figure out what's needed there and how you're going to do your methodological work? Also, I look at knowledge as being socially and historically located, and that we need to build relationships and value the knowledge of all the full range of stakeholders, and address power inequities so that we can safely bring people into our evaluation context. And she agrees with that, but then she says, yeah, but knowledge is both subjective and objective, and it's very relational, and it includes the spirituality and visioning. Okay, I feel like, wow, what if we, as a group of evaluators, sat down and said, how are we addressing the spiritual understandings and needs of the communities in which we work? And then she goes on with ethics and values. And here's where her work and the work of other scholars in Africa really came into focus through a conference that was held in Uganda that was funded by a couple of foundations. And they said, what would it look like if we had made in Africa evaluations? And they have prepared a position paper. Bagele was actually the first author of that position paper. And in there, she explores these assumptions that we need to take into consideration working with Indigenous communities. And the first of those is this relationality, which, if there's one thing my Indigenous friends have taught me, it's all about relationships. But, the nuance of describing it from an Indigenous point of view the belongingness, the togetherness, the interdependence, the relationships, the collectiveness, the love and harmony. You know, are these words that showed up in my methodology books? They didn't. And so, you know, it's really bringing us a dimension, I think, of humanity and groundedness, of looking at ethics from that perspective and looking at responsibility. And here she talks about the concept of Ubuntu, and Ubuntu may be familiar to some of you. For me, it was, it helped me see that if we consider ourselves as just in this moment, then we do things that we don't look at the consequences towards the future. But if we look at ourselves with the realization that we are connected from our ancestors, from everything that came before us, to everything that's here with us now, to everything that will happen in the future, that shifts your mindset to say, all right, if I need to be respectful of that knowledge that base that has come from ancestors, from elders, and I need to look not just at the humans who are impacted by this, but the context, the full environmental context. She uses the words living and non-living, and in the Native American communities, they wouldn't use the word non-living, but they would refer to the full scope of nature needs to be considered. So mountains, waters, everything, plants, vegetables, all those things. And if you live on the East Coast of the United States right now, maybe cicadas too. And so I think really her work has been to interrogate walking into a situation. And part of this was instigated by her experience of being asked to be the African expert at UN panels on evaluation. And her saying, you know, they asked me to come in there, but they start out from the colonizer's mindset. They expect us to just use the methodologies that have been present in the textbooks from the West without saying, wait, you know, our knowledge, our experience, our context is the one we have to start from. And then we can look at what the Westerner has to offer and say, yeah, that works for us, or it doesn't, or this is missing, or we could change that part of it to make it work for us. And so these are the kinds of arguments that that we make in the paper. And she does make a point of saying that, you know, the indigenous paradigm, she doesn't want us to look at it as being very insular, like, you know, you have to only do these things that are talked about within this indigenous framework, but she talks about it as having porous boundaries. So looking at how can we look at what has been done even in the post-positivism with randomized controlled trials, which she has included in some of her work, but everything that comes up to that randomized controlled trial is rooted in the African experience. She, you know, she sees the value of the mixed methods of looking at transformative work and saying, how can we borrow ideas from there that work for us? And so that, I think, kind of gives you an overview of the chapter or of the article. And so I'd like to stop now and entertain questions and have discussion.
Well, I can throw one out here to get us rolling. In your experiences, once again, looking over your bio, it appears you have a plethora of experience in context where this would be applicable. To really drive home the point of the importance of using approaches like this, where we come in with our own perception of what either methodology, approach, Have you seen or heard of experiences where that was not done, and perhaps the repercussions of that?
Yeah, the article itself includes two examples. The one about the mosquito netting being used to fight malaria, but the people use it for fishing, and then the poisons that are in the nets get into their systems. And so, you know, that's one example that's already in there. The other example that's talked about in the article, but not as extensively as it could be, when, you know, you have length limitations, is the HIV/AIDS prevention project that she was the director of, and I was on her advisory panel for methodology for that. So she and all her team did like all this work, and I would be the one who would say, okay, but did you think about this? And so they were working with a partner in the United States, a partner organization that had had extensive experience with HIV/AIDS prevention in the United States. And so they came to Africa and they said, we know what the problem is. The problem is that the kids just don't know how to prevent transmission of the disease. So we want to bring them to the university for 2 days and teach them like how to say no, how to use a condom, you know, things that are relevant knowledge-wise. Okay, so here's what had built up to that point is that the people in Botswana had done a very careful and thoughtful indigenous reflection and data collection on the understandings and the experiences of HIV/AIDS in youth in Botswana. And what they found, and they used some quantitative data to measure their knowledge, and like 98% knew exactly how the disease was transmitted. Maybe 2% said you could get it from a toilet seat or something. But they also then said they had a youth advisory group, and they said, you know, we know this is a sensitive topic here, so how do you think we should go about talking about it? And they said, well, we think you should train us as youth researchers to go to places where youth congregate, and we should have the conversations with them about their experiences. And so what they came back with was a great deal of qualitative data that really conveyed the sense of sadness around the disease, because everyone had lost people, you know, parents, brothers, sisters, aunties, friends, everyone had lost people. And so they just had a terrible sense of sadness. And they also felt like, you know, I'm probably going to die too, because everybody else is. So why shouldn't I have sex before I die? And so this is a very different starting point than saying you need knowledge. This is saying, where are you with this? How are you experiencing it? What impact is it having on your life? How could we come up with solutions that would allow them to carry this emotion into it and come out with hope? I mean, the real intervention was hope. And that's very different than knowledge. So that's another example of how coming in and thinking, I understand the problem, I understand the solution, but let me look at it from the Indigenous perspective, and not just in some glossy, ambiguous way, but in rigorous collection of data based on advice from people within that context who are telling you, this is something that's going to be better and give you better data than if you went out and had a survey that said, how many sexual partners do you have, and do you use a condom, and so forth. Okay, so 2 examples.
Perfect. Thank you very much. Any other questions?
I'm curious about the people who are here, if you are working with Indigenous communities or have worked with them, and what your experiences with that have been.
Hi, I'm Sarah Geiger. Nice to meet you. Thanks for your talk and the paper. We're not working with Indigenous communities, but an analogous, maybe somewhat analogous situation that I'm thinking about as we're talking is we work with the Illinois asthma program. We're all in Illinois. We're infiltrating your group. And we work with asthma home visiting programs that serve primarily really low income children in high burden asthma areas. And so we evaluate, knowledge of the caregivers, and the asthma home visiting programs work to try to improve asthma control for their children over 1 year period of time and reduce ED visits and other, urgent care visits and hospitalizations and that type of thing. But it has become clear, I don't know, it's sort of a similar situation in ways to the HIV example you gave. It just, we have the sense that there are all these other issues at play, aside from just the knowledge about asthma control or even the environmental factors. At least that's my sense. And so we're doing focus groups this summer to, with the staff, but then also with program participants, if we can get them to participate, and we have plan to incentivize them. So hopefully that will come to be. But I'm kind of curious about, like, once we have the data in hand, I'm interested to see what that will show. But what, you talked about infusing hope, and the intervention kind of changed and the method changed. I'm struggling with what that looks like. It seems so intangible, kind of a departure from the framework that we're used to using.
Well, the other part of it was that the youth shared things about how they understand and have learned about sexuality. And so this may have some parallels with your asthma group, because they would say, well, there is a proverb that says a man should have many women. And so rather than just saying, well, that's a cultural belief, let's just leave, we don't want to, whatever. They said, let's examine that and see who's being hurt by holding on to that as a belief here, and doing it with the youth, so that, the young men are going, yeah, well, the highest rate of infection is young women. So who is being hurt? And caring about your mother, your sister, your cousins. You don't want them to be hurt. And so that's what the intervention became, was focusing on what are the cultural issues that have come up in the early data collection, and saying, can we take a critical lens to that? Not because I'm the expert and I sit here and tell you that that's going to harm girls, but because they grow to that. And the other part of it was use of a framework called something like functional behavior. I think it's actually in the paper. But what it was a framework for building the youth to see that the choices they make can be what influences their future. So it's that kind of visioning. How do you see your future? What would it take to get there? And asking them and knowing from the literature the kinds of support that youth need. not saying you have to have your parents on board, but saying, you know, it's good to have adults who can be there for you. So can you do some reflection about who could be a support person for you? And it might be somebody in the family, but it might be somebody in the church, and it might be somebody in your community. So trying to build them up to the point of seeing that they could make a plan, they could vision a future, they could make a plan. Hi, baby. They could make a plan and they could have the supports in place. And one of the biggest outcomes was stronger relationships between the students and their parents or their significant adults. Because in their culture, it was really, really hard to talk about anything related to sex. And I know that there's a lot of things that are uncomfortable and a lot of things that cause tension, but if they're introduced in a way, and the youth did role playing, that was part of the intervention. How are you going to talk to your parents about this? You know, let's play that out and let's help each other figure out good ways to do it. So I don't know if all that would be, you know, something that would have relevance in your context.
It is, yeah, it's getting me to think outside the box for sure, and maybe tap into some skill sets that, or think about skill sets that I don't really feel like I personally have, but yeah, definitely giving me ideas.
Well, that's the great thing, is that you don't have to do it all yourself. As soon as you acknowledge that we're all connected and everybody brings knowledge of value and experiences of value, then you can start, you know, engaging with people and saying, hey, this is the issue, so help me out here.
Very true, yeah.
Tom, you had unmuted yourself. I know we only have a minute left, but.
Yeah, this is Dio.
Oh, yeah, I'll go ahead. Dio is a colleague of mine who did his dissertation on Made in Africa Value. I think you know him, Donna. I'll let him go, but
all right.
Yeah, I'll follow up later if we have time. But go ahead, Dio.
Yeah, thank you, Tom. Yeah, hi, Donna. Dio.
Hello.
I am an evaluation fellow with the CDC. Yeah, just based on the examples you shared, HIV and what I talked about concerning asthma, I just want to hear your thought about the use of conventional data collection method and this indigenous method of collecting data, like storytelling, campfires, just try to walk along with the cultural beliefs of people, indigenous people, when you go to decide to collect data or to kind of pass across some interventions to these indigenous folks. So I just want to hear about thought about that.
Dio, I think that is an area that the whole world needs to learn more about. We need to learn it from indigenous people, not necessarily so that I, as a Westerner, come into your country to use it, but so that we can be promoting the empowerment and the use of indigenous evaluators who understand better methods of data collection, methods that are comfortable to the community, that are viewed as valid, that they're more willing to share and take action on because they see their experience and their culture being valued. So anything you can do to write, to present, to promote, that would be great.
Thank you.
All right, and with that, I believe we're at time. I'm looking at Tom though, although you can't tell I'm looking at you. Okay. So yes, Donna, thank you a million times for doing this, talking about your article. Absolutely phenomenal. For everybody else, this will be recorded and posted